with its immense area, numerous natural divisions, still more numerous competing divisions, and abundant outlets to foreign countries. He said, there is no argument either of banking theory or expediency which dictates the creation of a single central banking institution, no matter how skillfully managed, how carefully controlled, or how patriotically conducted. To that end, the Federal Reserve System has modeled upon our federal political system. It establishes a group of independent but affiliated and sympathetic sovereignties, working on their own responsibility in local affairs, but united in national affairs by a superior body which is conducted from the national point of view. To drive the point home, the regional banks are the states and the Federal Reserve Board is the Congress. Glass's view of the Federal Reserve System as a series of central banks. He was in fact a steadfast defender of the reserve banks. Anytime the board sought to assert itself in the power struggles that arose, Glass wasn't alone. In the emphasis, E. W. Kimmerer, an early observer of the creation of the Fed, called the arrangement of 12 central banks with comparatively few branches instead of one central bank with many branches the most striking fact about the system. Wilson also agreed, we have purposely scattered the regional reserve banks and shall intensively disappointed if they do not exercise a very large measure of independence. Private governance. The three foundings at the end. This is Figure 1.1, Wilsonian Compromise of 1913. A couple names: Aldrich Plan, Glass Plan, Wilsonian Federal Reserve of 1913. And a graph with centralized, private governance, decentralized, and public governance. The final result was the Wilsonian Compromise. Figure 1.1 illustrates the nature of the Wilsonian Compromise and its alternatives. The institutional chaos of the First Federal Reserve. The compromise, however, proved more brilliant in political design than institutional clarity. As Alan Meltzer has noticed, tensions between the board and the reserve banks began before the system opened for business, because the statute in the tradition of many great political compromises left room for divergent interpretation, for competing fractions. The legislative authors of the Federal Reserve Act never defined a number of key terms and largely did not specify the power relationship between them among the Federal Reserve Board and the reserve banks. In the two places where the Fed exercised the most power, the proactive purchase of securities in the open market and the reactive discounting of securities brought to the doors of the reserve banks. Rivalries arose immediately, both between the board and the banks and among the banks themselves. Indeed, one of the most interesting footnotes in the Fed history, two reserve banks opened completing branches in Havana, Cuba, as a way to extend their international reach. Despite the federalist design of the system, the center formed in short order in New York City in the person of Benjamin Strong. The governor of the Federal Reserve of New York, according to his biographer Strong, was one of the world's most influential leaders in the fields of money and finance. An assessment of the subsequent commentary had contradicted from the founding of the Federal Reserve System until his death in 1928. This was the greatest influence on American monetary and banking policies. He had no close competitor. Strong was so ostensibly deeply committed to the public spirit of his work. In the top of the drawer of his desk, he always kept a note to himself written to the governor of his bank, to never forget that it was created to serve the employer and the working man, the producer and the consumer and the importer and the exporter, the creditor and the debtor, all in the interest of the country as a whole. I'm not going to critique this book at all. I appreciate the information. I actually love it all. I hope it reaches you in a great and specific way. But when he says support and then says all those job titles, references, and names, it's hard to accept all that as a fact, to actually take into consideration and care for all those in those specific lines of works. It's too much ground to cover, and it's almost self-contradictory, self-contradictions. So I'm not talking shit, I'm just saying my opinion. Alright, but not everyone agreed to that his policies matched his aims. Herbert Hoover, for example, blamed the Fed generally, and the New York Fed in particular, for causing the Great Depression. This orgy of speculation, alright, let's acknowledge he said orgy, the sex of speculation, orgies, was not a consequence of my administrative policies. He wrote, but of the mediocrities, yeah, I want to see it, mediocrities, at the Fed to understand the Great Depression of the Holy Grail of macroeconomics, wrote Ben Bernanke. They're an academic economist because this isn't primarily a history of a Federal Reserve System. We will have to skip the important, almost endless quest to answer whether the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. For our purposes, through it is important only to note that after Strong died and even before the decision-making apparatus in his curiously governed institution was in disarray, Strong succeeded in guiding the Fed's policies during his life, but dint of personality, not law. Outsiders to the system, including, ironically, Herbert Hoover himself, knew it was wielded power, but didn't know exactly how it did or by whom. Such was the state of things when Franklin Roosevelt team of economic experimenters arrived on the economic scene. During the 1932 campaign, he argued, the country needs and use the country's needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. Roosevelt lacked a consistent theory of regulatory response. The pride of the place following his 1932 election was for fast reaction, not necessarily legal or institutional coherence. As a historian, Richard Hofstadter put it, the New Deal was characterized as a chaos of experimentation. Despite the Fed's centrality to the banking system, institutional reform of the Fed was not high on the initial list of priorities. There were nevertheless adjustments that came in the first round of economic legislation. In the Glass-Steagall of Act 1933, more famous for the creation of federal deposit insurance and the separation of commercial and banking institutions, Congress created the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, as initials, as the central body that would make proactive decisions about the purchase of the market securities including governmental securities. The failure of the pure model of governance by personality needed a legislative boost and received it in the creation of the FOMC. Importantly, though, the Federalist system created under Wilson was reinforced in the scholars have called the First New Deal, or the burst of legislative activity in FDR's first 100 days. The FOMC, created in that initial burst, consisted of the 12 Reserve Bank presidents and was meant to add a more formal structure on monetary coordination that excluded the governmental Federal Reserve Board. Nibbling around the edges of the Wilsonian Federalist Central Bank might have remained the order of the day it had not been for Mariner C. Eccles, Eccles, however you would pronounce that in English. Mariner S. Eccles, perhaps the most intriguing figure in Federal Reserve histories. Eccles's father was a Scottish immigrant, a Mormon convert, a bigamist. Marrier's mother was his father's second wife, and in time one of the wealthiest men in the state of Utah. Eslis thrived in his father's business and expanded into mining, timber, and especially banking. He was a millionaire in his own right by the age of 22. Eslis rose to national prominence in part because of his success as a banker during the height of the banking crisis of the Great Depression, with bank failure rates reaching unprecedented heights. Eslis's bank survived, largely owing to his own savvy ability to maintain credibility and confidence. While there were other successful bankers, what made Eslis noteworthy was that he was also something of a radical. For example, in the 1913 Utah State Bankers Convention, he laid out his theory of the Depression and its cure in plain language. Our depression was not brought about as a result of extravagance, he said. It was not brought about as a result of high taxation. It came instead, we did not consume as a nation more than we produced. We consumed far less than we produced. The difficulty is that we were not sufficiently extravagant as a nation. There was a simple reason for this. The theory of hard work and thrift as a means of pulling us out of the depression is unsound economically. True hard work means more production, but thrift and economy means less consumption. Now reconcile those two forces, will you? Eslis has a solution too. There is only one agency, in my opinion, that can turn the cycle upward, and that is the government. In modern parlance, we call arguments like the Keynesian, but 1913 was 4 years before the John Maynard Keynes had published the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, the book that expounded the nation that government should be responsible for compensating for lack in consumer demand. Though they had never met the millionaire Mormon from Utah, had anticipated the Draper Cambridge, Don's worldview, and an assuming historical aside, the two did eventually meet during the Bretton Woods negotiations about the future of the world's post-war economic order. Despite their common diagnosis of depression and consumption, they didn't take well to each other. Eslis thought the British needed to make better assurances of repayment to the United States for pre-war loans, a source of great consternation to the British. No wonder that man is a Mormon, Keynes reported in a colleague outside of Eslis's hearing. No single woman would stand him. Eslis didn't make much more headway with the bankers and businessmen who heard him articulate these heretical views in Utah in 1932 than he did with Kenya's in 1944. Poor Eslis, a president of a Western railroad, is said to have remarked, "He must have had so terrible a time with his banks that he is losing his mind." No matter, their opinions mattered much less than that of Rex Tugwell, already part of FDR's original Brains Trust. And Eslis Tugwell had discovered an indispensable resource of a Western banker whose ideas were even more radical than the incoming administration's. Eslis came to work with the new Roosevelt administration as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury. Eventually, Eslis was considered for the position of governor of the Federal Reserve Board to give a new sense on how the board governor position was then perceived. The post became vacant. Then Eugene Black resigned to take the position of governor of Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Eslis refused the president's offer. In response to inquiries of his availability, he responded that he would not touch the position of governor of the Federal Reserve Board with a 10-foot pole unless fundamental exchanges were made in the Federal Reserve System. Roosevelt invited him to propose his view of what those changes should be, and he and the assistant prepared a 3-page blueprint of what amounted to a refounding of the Federal Reserve. The refounding would eliminate the Federalist compromise, he narrowed his sights on the Federal Reserve's banks. Although the board is nominally the supreme monetary authority in this country, he wrote in a memo to Roosevelt, it is generally conceded that in the past it has not played an effective role and that the system has been generally dominated by the governors of the Federal Reserve banks. As an unfortunate result, he continued, banker interest, as represented by the individual Reserve Bank governors, has prevailed over the public interest as represented by the board. Esli's position was notable. Eslis was himself a banker whose views were represented by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and yet he sought the bank's exclusion from national policy.